The pregnancy test was positive. Sienna Calloway sat on the closed lid of the toilet seat in the single-stall restroom of Velour Café, staring at the two pink lines like they were a verdict she hadn't finished reading. The test stick was cold between her fingers. The restroom smelled like cedar and bergamot. Some boutique diffuser. The café probably paid too much for. And the soft jazz bleeding through the wall was doing absolutely nothing to slow her heart rate. She had bought the test at the drugstore 3 blocks away, walked the rest of the distance with it, stuffed inside a paper bag inside her purse, and told herself she was being cautious, not afraid. She had been lying to herself since the moment she walked out the door of the apartment she shared with a man whose last name she now carried, but whose face she still could not read after 8 months of marriage. 8 months. And now this. 2 lines. No ambiguity. No smudging. No, maybe. Just a fact, sitting in the palm of her hand, like a stone she had no idea where to put down. She pressed her back against the cool tile wall and tried to think clearly. The math was simple and damning. She was somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks along. Which meant it had happened sometime in late September. Which meant it had happened during the one night. The careful distance she maintained between herself and Damien Voss had collapsed without either of them naming what they were doing. She remembered the rain. She remembered his hand at her jaw. Not rough, just certain. The way he did everything. Like he had already decided the outcome and was simply executing it. She had told herself the next morning that it had been an aberration, a breach in the contract they were both pretending was a marriage. And she had rebuilt the wall before breakfast. She had apparently missed something structural. Her phone vibrated against the porcelain edge of the sink where she had set it, and she leaned forward to look at the screen. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. But there was something in the timing, something about the way the notification appeared at the exact moment her brain was scrambling for an exit, that made her thumb slide across the glass. The message was 4 words. Don't leave yet. Sienna. She read it twice. She did not know this number. She had not given anyone her location. She had told no one she was coming here today. Not her sister. Not the one colleague she still occasionally had lunch with. Certainly not Damien. She sat very still, the test still in her hand, her pulse doing something complicated in her throat. Then, from beyond the restroom wall, she heard the front door of the cafe open. She heard the hostess say something in a pleasant, professional tone, and then she heard a voice she had spent 14 months trying to forget say, "Yeah, just looking for someone. She here yet?" Kyle Mercer. His voice was exactly the same, that casual authority that always sounded like a question but never actually was. Sienna shoved the pregnancy test into her purse, zipped it, stood up, and looked at herself in the mirror above the sink. Her face was composed. She had learned, during the 2 years she had dated Kyle, how to make her face do things her insides were not doing. She turned on the faucet, let the cold water run over her hands for 5 seconds, and dried them on the paper towel without rushing. Then she unlocked the door and walked out. He was already at her table. That was the thing about Kyle, he always knew where to position himself before you arrived, so that you were always the one approaching him, always the one who appeared to be seeking him out. He was sitting in the chair across from the one she had been using, her half-finished cortado still on the table, her notebook open to the page of notes she had been pretending to take before she excused herself to the restroom. He looked exactly as she remembered, broad-shouldered in a way that had once seemed protective and now just seemed designed to take up space. Jawline clean, eyes the color of expensive whiskey. Wearing that expression of mild amusement he deployed when he wanted you to feel like you were overreacting. He smiled at her as she crossed the floor. "There she is," he said. "You look good, Sienna. Married life must agree with you." She sat down across from him and picked up her cortado. Her hands were steady. "I didn't invite you here, Kyle." She kept her voice low and flat, the way you spoke to something dangerous in an enclosed space. No sudden movements, no escalation. I'm aware, he said, leaning back, folding his arms. I invited myself. How long has it been? 9 months. 14, she said, and immediately wished she hadn't, because his smile widened in a way that told her he had already known the exact number and was pleased she did too. She set the cup down. Say whatever you came to say, and then go. He tilted his head. That's not very warm. You're not even a little happy to see me, no, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said out loud in weeks. He leaned forward then, elbows on the table, voice dropping just enough to make the conversation feel private, even though the cafe was full. Late morning light coming through the tall windows. People on laptops, couples sharing pastries, a barista steaming milk at a machine that was too loud and not loud enough. I heard you got married, Kyle said, pretty fast. 2. What was it? 6 weeks after we split. Your family must have been relieved. Calloway girl finally settling down. I'm not doing this, Sienna said. She reached for her notebook to close it, a signal she was preparing to leave. But his hand came down flat on the page before she could move it. Not hard, just final. I think you are, he said softly, because you're smart enough to know that me being here is not a coincidence, and whatever you've been telling yourself about that marriage keeping you safe. You should probably hear what I have to say before you go back to believing it. The hair on the back of her neck rose. She looked at him, and for a moment she saw it, the thing she had always eventually seen under the performance, which was not anger or jealousy, but something colder and more organized. He was delivering a message. He had been sent. She did not let that show on her face. You should leave, she said. His expression shifted, just slightly, and that was when she knew the conversation had moved into territory she did not control. He stood up, and she had half a second of thinking he was actually going to go, before his hand shot out and wrapped around the front of her throat. Not squeezing, not quite, but present. Fingers pressing against her pulse in a way that every person within 12 feet of them could see. Someone at the next table made a sharp sound. A woman said, "Oh my God." The barista stopped steaming milk. Sienna did not move. She had learned, with Kyle, that moving made it worse. She held very still and looked directly into his eyes and said nothing. And somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that was still running calculations even while her body flooded with cold, she remembered the text message, "Don't leave yet. Sienna." And then, from the far corner of the cafe, from a table she had walked past when she came in and registered only as occupied by a man in a dark suit with a coffee he hadn't touched, she heard the precise sound of ceramic being set against a saucer. Quiet, deliberate, the way you set something down when you have made a decision and no longer need it. Kyle's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. His eyes moved, just for a second. And in that second, something in his expression changed from controlled to something close to uncertain. And Sienna thought he didn't know. He came here knowing exactly what he was walking into, and there is something in this room he did not account for. She did not look toward the corner. She kept her eyes on Kyle and waited. Damien Voss had been watching Kyle Mercer for 6 minutes before the man touched his wife. That was the part no one in the cafe understood. The part that would never make it into any account of what happened that Tuesday morning on Lexington, that the most dangerous person in the room had been sitting in the corner the entire time, drinking coffee he didn't want, conducting a meeting he could have held anywhere, and choosing to hold it here because his wife had told his head of security she was going to Velour, and his head of security had made the mistake of mentioning it. In a briefing 2 days ago, in the same sentence as Kyle Mercer's name appearing on a flight manifest out of Miami, Damien had not told Sienna. He had wanted to see what Kyle would do first. That had been a miscalculation. And Damien Voss did not make miscalculations often enough to have developed a comfortable relationship with them. Across the table from him, Marcus Reyes, his second, was saying something about the Delgado shipment and the revised timetable for the port handoff, and Damien was hearing approximately 40% of it. The other 60% of his attention was on the table near the window, where Sienna sat across from a man who had, 14 months ago, put her in a hospital with bruised ribs and a split lip that her family had told the attending physician was from a fall. Damien knew this because he had read every document her family signed in the 2 months before their own families arranged this marriage, and because he was very good at understanding the shape of a thing people were trying not to show him. He had looked at Sienna Calloway at their first meeting and seen someone who had learned to take up less space than she actually occupied, and he had filed that information away with the precision he applied to everything. And he had married her 6 weeks later, and he had spent 8 months waiting for her to understand that the space was hers now. She had not gotten there yet. He had not known how to help her get there. That was his own miscalculation. The longer-standing one. Marcus stopped talking. He had worked with Damien for 11 years and had learned the specific quality of silence that meant the conversation was over. He picked up his own coffee, glanced once toward the window table, and then looked back at Damien with the expression of a man who was professionally incurious about things that were none of his business. "You want me to step outside?" Marcus asked. "Stay," Damien said. He watched Kyle lean forward. He watched Kyle's hand come down on top of Sienna's notebook. He watched Sienna's shoulders drop by precisely 3 millimeters, the way they did when she was regulating herself, pulling everything inward, making herself smaller to survive something. He had seen that particular 3-millimeter drop twice before, once at a formal dinner when his uncle had made a comment about her family's finances, and once on their wedding night when she had stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at him like she was calculating the distance to the nearest exit. Both times he had done nothing. He had told himself it was because she needed room, not rescue. He was no longer sure that distinction mattered as much as he had believed. Kyle stood up, and then Kyle's hand was on his wife's throat. The cafe did not go silent because most people hadn't seen it yet. The angle was wrong from most of the tables, but the woman at the adjacent table had, and her sharp intake of breath was enough. Damien set his cup down against the saucer. He was already standing. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch Kyle. He simply walked across the floor of the cafe at the pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, stopped 18 inches behind Kyle's left shoulder, and said, at a volume meant only for the 3 of them, "You have exactly 2 seconds to take your hand off my wife before I make a decision that inconveniences us both." He paused 1 beat. The second is almost gone. Kyle let go. He turned around, and Damien watched him process what he was seeing, the recognition moving through his face in stages, like a man reading news he had been given but hadn't believed until this moment. Kyle was not a stupid man. He was a man who had operated his entire life inside the protection of his father's name, and that protection had made him reckless in ways that a self-made man never would have been. He took 1 step back. "Voss," he said, and managed to make it sound nearly casual. Damien looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that contained no anger at all, which was, in Damien's experience, significantly more effective than the kind that did. "Leave the city," Damien said. That was all. Kyle looked once at Sienna, something moving in his expression that was not quite regret and not quite warning. And then he walked out. The front door swung shut. The barista started steaming milk again. Damien turned to Sienna. She was sitting very straight, her cortado in front of her, her hands flat on the table. There was a faint mark at the front of her throat, not a bruise yet, but the kind of pressure red that would bloom into one by evening. He looked at it for 1 second and then looked at her face instead. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I've been walking since I was 11 months old," she said. and stood up, and picked up her purse. And that was when he knew she was furious, because Sienna only reached for precision when she was trying to keep something from spilling. The car ride back to the apartment took 9 minutes, and neither of them spoke. His driver, trained in the particular art of not existing when Damien needed him not to, kept his eyes on the road and the privacy partition at a height that communicated availability without imposing presence. Sienna sat with her purse in her lap and her face turned toward the window, and Damien sat with 4 inches of seat between them and watched the city go past and thought about the fact that he had known Kyle Mercer was in New York for 48 hours and had said nothing, and that Sienna was going to be entirely correct to be angry about that. She waited until they were inside the apartment, until the elevator doors had closed behind them, and they were standing in the entryway of the 43rd floor unit with its view of Midtown that she had never once commented on in 8 months of living here, before she turned around and looked at him directly, which she did not always do. "You were already there," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. "You knew he was coming." He considered the value of a partial truth and discarded it. "I knew he was in the city. I didn't know his specific plan." She looked at him for a long moment, and he held it, which he could do longer than most people, because most people read stillness as the absence of something, and he had learned to let them. "You used me as bait," she said. "No," he said. "I made an error in judgment about the timeline. Those are different things. They feel the same from where I'm standing," she said, and walked past him into the apartment, and that was the end of the conversation, because Sienna, when she was done, and pressing her only ever produced the 3mm drop, and he was finished watching that happen. He stood in the entryway for a moment after she disappeared down the hall, then walked to the window and looked out at the city and took out his phone and sent a message to Marcus. Full workup on Mercer's last 72 hours. Everyone he spoke to. "I want it tonight." Then he put his phone away and stood there in the grey November light and thought about the mark on his wife's throat, which he had not mentioned because mentioning it would have required him to describe what it had felt like to see it. And that was a distance he did not yet know how to cross in language. He knew how to cross it in action. He had crossed it in the café. Whether that was enough, he genuinely did not know. In the bedroom, which Sienna had made her own over 8 months in small, unannounced ways. A throw blanket on the chair he never sat in. 3 books on the nightstand. A photograph of her sister on the dresser that he had never asked about. She sat on the edge of the bed and opened her purse. She took out the pregnancy test. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrapped it in a tissue, put it back, zipped the purse, and set it on the floor beside her feet. Not yet. Not tonight. She needed at least one wall to stay standing. Sienna made the appointment at 7:15 in the morning, standing in the kitchen in her socks while the coffee was brewing, using the scheduling app on her phone with the screen tilted slightly away from the doorway out of a habit she could not entirely justify. The appointment was at 11. Dr. Farrow's office on East 68th, an OB she had found by searching discreet obstetrics, Manhattan at 2 in the morning 2 nights ago, which felt like the kind of search that said more about the state of her marriage than any conversation she and Damien had ever managed to have. She confirmed the booking, put her phone face down on the counter, and poured her coffee, and told herself she was being practical. She was gathering information. She could not make a decision about something she had not yet had confirmed by a physician. A pregnancy test from a drugstore on Lexington was not a medical opinion, and she needed a medical opinion before she could think clearly about anything else. This was all entirely reasonable. The fact that she was also, underneath the reasonableness, terrified, was something she set on a shelf in the back of her mind and did not look at directly. Damien was already gone when she came out of her room. He was often already gone. In 8 months she had mapped the rhythms of his absence, the way you learned the schedule of a building, when the elevator would be busy, which hours the lobby was empty, what silence in a large space actually sounded like when the person who filled it had left. He occupied rooms differently than other people. He did not make noise exactly, but his presence had a specific gravity, and its absence was its own kind of texture. She noticed it every morning and said nothing about it to anyone, including herself, for as long as she could manage. This morning she managed until she was halfway through her coffee, and then she stopped pretending she wasn't noticing and just sat with it for a moment, which felt like a small and dangerous concession. She left the apartment at 10:15, told the building's front desk she was going out, which she was not required to do but had fallen into the habit of because it felt marginally better than walking past the two men, Damien stationed at the lobby entrance without acknowledging them. She did not tell them where she was going. She took a cab instead of the car service, which was not unusual enough to flag as deliberate, but gave her 40 blocks of being in a vehicle that was not reporting her location to anyone on Damien's payroll. She sat in the back and watched the city do its mid-morning thing, the delivery trucks and the school groups and the tourists with their phones up, and she thought about what she was going to say when the doctor asked about the father. She had not gotten to a clean answer yet. Dr. Farrow's office was the kind of place that understood privacy without being asked to. The waiting room had individual seating arranged to prevent eye contact between patients. The intake forms did not ask for an emergency contact unless you offered one, and the receptionist had the professional warmth of someone who had been specifically hired for her ability to make people feel neither observed nor overlooked. Sienna filled out the forms with her own name and her own insurance, and sat with a magazine she did not read until a nurse called her back. The confirmation came 40 minutes later. 7 weeks. 2 days. Heartbeat present. Everything measuring on schedule. The doctor gave her a folder of information and a referral for a full panel and asked if she had questions. Sienna asked 3. All clinical. All the kind of questions that revealed nothing about her actual situation. And then she thanked Dr. Barrow and left. She sat in a cab going back downtown and held the folder in her lap and looked out the window and thought, 7 weeks. 7 weeks and 4 days ago was the 22nd of September, which was the night it had rained for 6 hours straight, and the power in the building had flickered twice, and Damien had come home at midnight from something he didn't name and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her across the room with an expression she hadn't known what to do with. And she still didn't. And now there was a heartbeat and a folder and a Tuesday morning that was going to require her to make a decision she had been trying to postpone since the moment she had seen 2 pink lines. She pressed her hand flat against the folder and looked at the street and did not cry, which felt like an achievement of moderate significance. She was home by 12:30. She went to the small study off the main hallway, the room she used as her own workspace, and she opened her laptop and pulled up the document she had been building for 3 weeks without fully admitting to herself what it was, a review of the contract. The marriage agreement had been drawn up by both families' legal teams and was 41 pages, and she had read it enough times to have sections of it in memory. But she had been going back through it with the specific eye of someone looking for an exit that did not cost more than she could afford. The contract was for 2 years. They were 8 months in. There were provisions for early dissolution, but the penalty clauses were structured in a way that made them function more as deterrents than as genuine options. And she had been trying to understand whether those clauses would still apply if she could demonstrate that the terms of the agreement had not been met. Specifically the clause about mutual good faith conduct, which was vague enough to mean almost anything, and had therefore been useless in every reading until she started reading it as a door instead of a wall. She picked up her phone and called her attorney, not the family attorney, not anyone connected to either the Callaway or Voss orbit, a woman named Patricia Osei who had been her own choice, retained 18 months ago when she had first understood that the conversation about her marriage was going to happen whether she was prepared for it or not. Patricia answered on the second ring. They talked for 11 minutes. Sienna asked about the mutual good faith clause. Patricia said she would need to review the specific language again, but that it was a viable angle if Sienna could document conduct that fell outside its terms. Sienna said she understood. Patricia asked if something had happened. Sienna said, not yet, which was almost true. They ended the call. In the kitchen. She did not hear the door. She did not hear anything, which was the way it always was with Damien. He moved through spaces without announcing himself, and she had stopped being startled by it months ago, which itself felt like a form of adaptation she hadn't consented to. He was standing in the hallway doorway when she looked up. Jacket off. The particular quality of stillness about him that meant he had been there for more than 1 second. She did not know how much he had heard. His face told her nothing, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he did not move away when she registered his presence. He stayed in the doorway and looked at her. And after a moment, he said, "Patricia, osez." Not a question. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. Another silence. The apartment held it the way apartments held things when the insulation was good and the street noise was below, and the two people inside it were both very practiced at not filling silence with things they would have to take back. "Are you leaving?" he said. Still, not a question. She looked at him, at the doorway, at the way he was standing in it, not blocking it exactly, but occupying it completely. And she thought about 7 weeks and a folder in a desk drawer and a contract clause and the mark that had faded from her throat overnight. And she said, "I don't know yet," which was the most honest thing she had said to him since their wedding night, when he had asked her if she was all right, and she had said fine, and they had both agreed. Without words. To believe it, his jaw shifted. Barely. He nodded once. Slowly. And pushed off the door frame and walked away down the hall. And she listened to his footsteps and the sound of his study door closing. Quiet and final. And she put her face in her hands and sat there for a moment in the dark behind her palms, just breathing. That evening, after dinner that they ate at separate ends of a table designed for 8, Damien received a message from Marcus. He read it in his study with the door shut. The message was a summary of 48 hours of tracking Kyle Mercer had arrived on a private flight registered to a shell company that traced back, through 3 layers of incorporation, to a holding entity in the Cayman Islands that Damien's financial intelligence team had flagged 18 months ago as a likely vehicle for Vincent Mercer's legitimate adjacent operations. Kyle had met with 2 men in Midtown on Monday evening. One of them Damien recognized. The other was new. Kyle had not acted alone in coming to New York, and he had not come because of any feeling he still carried for Sienna. He had come because someone had sent him, and whoever had sent him had also sent a message to that unknown number on Sienna's phone, which his security team had pulled from the cafe's cellular proximity logs with the kind of efficiency Damien paid them specifically to provide. "Don't leave yet." Sienna. Someone had known she would be there. Someone had known her schedule before Kyle arrived. Damien set the phone down on the desk and looked at the wall for a long moment and thought about the word bait, which Sienna had used yesterday and which he had corrected. He was no longer certain his correction had been accurate. Kyle came to the apartment on Thursday evening, which was either bold or desperate, and Sienna had spent enough time around both qualities to know they were not mutually exclusive. She was in the kitchen when the intercom buzzed, and the front desk said there was a Mr. Mercer asking to come up, and she stood there for a moment with her hand on the counter and thought about saying no, and then thought about the text message, about the shell company, about the way Kyle had looked at her in the cafe in that last second before Damien arrived. Something moving in his face that she had not been able to name at the time and had not stopped trying to name since. She told the front desk to send him up. Then she picked up her phone and sent a message to Damien's number times. "Kyle is here. I'm letting him up." She did not ask permission. She gave information. There was a difference, and she needed there to be one. Kyle looked worse than he had on Tuesday. Not physically. He was still dressed well, still carrying himself with the posture of someone who had been told his whole life that rooms were built for him. But there was something off in his eyes, a sharpness that she recognized as the specific alertness of a man who had recently been reminded that he was not the most dangerous person in his vicinity. He came into the entryway and stopped, and she noticed he kept himself near the door, which was not typical Kyle behavior. Kyle historically positioned himself at the center of things. "He's not here," she said. It wasn't a question either. Kyle almost smiled. "I know," he said. "I waited." She looked at him. "Say what you came to say." She did not offer him a seat. She did not offer him anything. She stood in the middle of her own kitchen and crossed her arms and waited. And something in her stillness must have told him that the performance was not going to work here, because he dropped it. Not all at once, but in the way a person dropped something heavy they had been carrying too long. A gradual and slightly graceless release. "My father sent me," he said. She had known this was coming since Tuesday, and it still landed with weight. "Vincent," she said. "Yes." He put his hands in his pockets, and she recognized that too. It was what Kyle did when he was trying to look smaller than he was, which he only ever did when he was afraid. He's been planning it for 8 months. Since your wedding, he wanted to know if Voss would move to protect you, or if the marriage was just paper. She let that sit for a moment. 8 months. Since the beginning. And the café, she said. The café was supposed to be a controlled test. Kyle said, "I was supposed to approach you, make contact, see if Voss had eyes on you. If he showed up, that confirmed you were a real asset to him, something he'd protect, which meant you were something my father could use as leverage to force a renegotiation of the Eastern port contracts." The words were flat and organized. The speech of someone who had rehearsed it, who had decided on the drive over that the only version of this conversation he could survive was the honest one. "And grabbing my throat," she said, keeping her voice even. "Was that part of the controlled test?" Kyle looked at the floor. "No," he said. "That was me. A pauser. I saw you sitting there, and I thought about 14 months and I lost the thread for a second. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." She looked at him for a long moment. Kyle, who had once told her that the reason he held on so tight was because he loved her more than she understood. Kyle, who had put her in a hospital and called it passion and genuinely believed the distinction mattered. Kyle, who was standing in her kitchen right now, looking like a man who was trying to do one right thing inside. A completely wrong situation, and was not sure he had the architecture for it. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. He looked up. "Because he's going to move against Voss regardless. The café was just reconnaissance. He already knows what he wanted to know. I told him the test was inconclusive, that Voss showing up might have been coincidence. But he doesn't believe me, and I think he's right not to." He paused. "If you're actually in this marriage, if it's real in any way that matters, then you're going to be in the middle of whatever he does next. I thought you should know what you're standing in." She studied his face. There was no version of Kyle Mercer that was simple. She had learned that over 2 years and 14 months of aftermath, he was capable of genuine feeling and genuine cruelty in the same hour, sometimes about the same thing. And standing here, she could not entirely determine which one she was receiving, but she believed the information. That part rang true in the specific way that things rang true when they had been assembled from fact rather than constructed for effect. "You should go," she said. "Sienna, you've said what you came to say. Go." He held her gaze for one more second, and then nodded, once, and turned toward the entryway. He was 3 steps from the door when it opened. Damien came in without hurry, without any visible adjustment upon seeing Kyle standing in his entryway, with a particular quality of calm that Sienna had come to understand was not the absence of something but the absolute presence of control. He looked at Kyle. Kyle looked at him. The air in the entryway had the specific density of a room that contained exactly as much danger as it could hold, without any of it becoming visible. "I got your message," Damien said, and it took Sienna a moment to realize he was speaking to her, not to Kyle. Without taking his eyes off Kyle, he was leaving, she said. Damien stepped aside from the doorway. "Then, leave," he said to Kyle, pleasantly, in the tone of a man for whom pleasantness was a tactical choice rather than a social one. Kyle left. Damien closed the door. He turned around and looked at Sienna across the length of the entryway, and she looked back at him, and the apartment was very quiet around them. The good insulation. The traffic 43 floors below. The refrigerator cycling in the kitchen. "How much did you hear?" she said. "Enough," he said. "The port contracts." "Yes." "Vincent Mercer." "Yes." 8 months. A pause. "Yes," he said, and something in the way he said it was different from the other yeses. Slightly heavier, carrying the weight of a man who had just confirmed something he had suspected and had been hoping not to confirm. He moved past her into the kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water and set one on the counter near her without comment. And she picked it up because her mouth was dry and she was tired of being strategic about small things. She drank. He stood across the kitchen island from her, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, and she looked at him, at the line of his jaw, at the way he was watching her with that expression she could never fully parse, the one that always felt like it was doing more than it showed. And she thought about 7 weeks, and a folder in a drawer, and a contract on her laptop, and the clause she had been trying to turn into a door. And she thought about the cafe, about the ceramic cup set down with the deliberateness of a decision already made. And she thought about the rain on the 22nd of September and the way he had looked at her across a dark kitchen like she was, something he had been trying to figure out how to say. And she understood, with a clarity that arrived the way clarity sometimes did, not gradually but all at once, like a pressure change, that she had been reading every piece of evidence correctly and drawing the wrong conclusion from all of it. She set the glass down. She looked at him. He looked back, and before she could stop herself, before the part of her brain that had been managing exits and clauses and contingencies could intervene, she said, "I'm pregnant." The words sat in the kitchen air between them. Damien did not move. His expression did not change, not immediately. And in that first second she felt the familiar cold of having handed something over to someone and not knowing what they would do with it. But then she saw it, moving through his face the way the recognition had moved through Kyle's in the cafe, in stages, and it was nothing like what she had expected. It was not calculation, not the rapid assessment of strategic value she had been bracing for. It was something rawer and less organized, something that looked, for just a moment, almost like relief, as though some part of him had been waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. He exhaled slowly through his nose. He looked at her for a long time. "How long?" he said, his voice exactly the same, completely controlled, except that his hand had moved from where it was resting on the counter to grip the edge of it, the knuckles just barely different. 7 weeks, she said. Another silence. She forced herself not to fill it. She had spent 8 months filling silences in this apartment, and she was done. She needed to hear what lived in this one on its own. "You've known," he said. "Since Tuesday," she said. "The cafe." He processed that. She watched him do it. "You were going to leave," he said. Not an accusation, just the shape of what he had understood. She did not say no. "I was trying to figure out if I had a reason to stay," she said. "That's honest." "Yes," she said. "I'm trying that." He looked at her for another long moment, and then he said, very quietly. And now, she held his gaze. The apartment held its breath. She thought about 7 weeks and a heartbeat and a man who had walked across a cafe floor like he had all the time in the world to do the most certain thing he had ever done. "Now, I need to know if you want this," she said. "Not in the contract. Not for the families. You." He was quiet for so long that she thought she had miscalculated again. Thought she had handed the honest thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. And then he said, "I've wanted this since before I knew what this was." He said it like it was a fact he was reporting, like it was something he had known for a while and was only now finding the language for. She looked at him across the kitchen island, in the quiet apartment, 43 floors above a city that did not know or care about any of this, and she felt something shift in her chest. Not fall away exactly, more like reorient, the way a compass settled when you stopped moving. "Okay," she said. It was not a yes to everything. It was not a resolution. It was the first word of a different conversation. The one they had not been able to have for 8 months because they had both been too busy surviving the one they were in. He looked at her. She looked at him. The refrigerator cycled. Outside, 43 floors down. The city kept going, indifferent and enormous. And inside this kitchen, 2 people who had spent 8 months at the wrong distance from each other stood 4 feet apart and did not close the gap yet. But for the first time, neither of them was looking for the door. Vincent Mercer ceased to be a problem on a Saturday. 11 days after the cafe, Chenna did not ask how. She had learned, in the weeks since the kitchen conversation, that there were categories of information Damien would give her if she asked directly and categories he would not. And she was still mapping the boundary between them, which shifted depending on what he was trying to protect her from, and what he was trying to protect her from knowing he was protecting her from. These were different things, and she was getting better at telling them apart. What she knew was this: on Saturday morning, Damien had a series of phone calls in his study with the door open, which was new. And by Saturday evening, Marcus had come by the apartment, and the 2 of them had sat at the dining table with documents she had not been invited to look at and had not tried to look at. And by Sunday, the particular quality of alertness that had lived in Damien's posture for 11 days was gone, not relaxed. He did not relax exactly, but settled, the way a building settled after a structural issue had been addressed below the surface. She noticed it at breakfast on Sunday when he poured his coffee and stood at the window without scanning the street first. And she thought, "It's done," and said nothing, and ate her toast, and felt the city outside doing its ordinary Sunday things, and was quietly, privately grateful for the silence. She was 14 weeks along by the time they had the real conversation, not the kitchen conversation, which had been a beginning, the first sentence of something rather than the thing itself, but the one that happened on a Tuesday evening in late December when the apartment was warm and the windows were dark with early winter dark, and she was sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her reading, something she kept losing the thread of. And Damien came and sat at the other end of the couch, which he did not usually do. He usually took the chair. And she looked up and he looked at her and said, "I want to talk about what happens next." She put her book down. "Okay," she said. "All of it," he said, "not just the practical things." She looked at him. Damien, who solved problems before they became emergencies, who communicated through action and proximity and the precise deployment of resources, who had never once in 8 months of marriage said anything that required him to be uncertain in front of her. "All right," she said, and turned toward him on the couch, and waited. He was quiet for a moment. Not the comfortable silence he usually occupied, but something with more friction in it. The silence of a man assembling something he did not have a practiced version of. She did not help him. She had decided, sometime in the 11 days since the kitchen, that she was done helping people get to the thing they were trying to say to her, that she had spent too many years finishing sentences for people who were using her completion of them as an excuse not to mean them. She waited. He said, "I know what you thought this was." She held very still. I know you came into it looking for the exit from the beginning. I know the contract felt like a different kind of trap. A pause. I know about the hospital. She had expected this, and it still cost her something to hear it said plainly. You've known the whole time. She said. Yes. He said. And you didn't say anything. No. He said. Because I didn't know how to say it without it sounding like I was telling you I'd read your file and understood your damage. Which is not. He stopped. Started again. I'm not good at this. He said. I'm aware of that. I've known what I felt about you since approximately the 3rd week, and I have not said it once in 8 months, because every time I got close to it, I thought about what it would do to you to hear something like that from someone you were still deciding whether to trust. And I thought the thing to do was wait. To show you, instead of tell you. To give you room. And I think I was wrong about that. I think I gave you so much room that you couldn't see me in it. He said this last part to the middle distance between them, not at her. And she understood that this was what it cost him. The not looking, because Damien held eye contact the way other people held their breath, and breaking it was the tell. She had just never known what it was a tell of. Until now. She thought about the chair he never sat in that now had her blanket on it, which he had moved twice to sit in and moved back both times without comment. She thought about the photograph of her sister on the dresser, which he had. She now knew, because her sister had mentioned it 2 weeks ago, with the specific delight of someone releasing a secret they had been holding too long. Asked about in a phone call he had made without telling Sienna, because he wanted to know her sister's name before he used it. She thought about the morning after the café when she had come out of her room and found a cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, prepared the way she took it, which she had never told him and he had never asked, which meant he had simply paid attention to something she had not known she was showing. She had drunk the coffee and put the cup in the sink and not said a word, because she had been too busy telling herself it meant nothing to notice that she already knew it meant everything. Damien, she said. He looked at her. She held it. I owe you something honest, she said. I came into this marriage with a list of reasons why it was going to be exactly what I expected it to be. And I spent 8 months collecting evidence for that list and ignoring everything that didn't fit. And the reason I did that is because the last time I trusted someone who had more power than me, it took me 2 years and a hospital stay to understand what I had trusted him with. She paused. That's not an excuse. That's just what I brought in with me. He nodded. Once. Not interrupting. I know what you've been doing, she said. I know it now. I think I've known for a while and kept finding reasons to reinterpret it because it was safer to believe you were managing me than to believe you were. She stopped. He waited, which was the thing he was actually best at. The patience that most people read as coldness and that she now understood was the opposite. It was the patience of someone who believed the other person would get there and was willing to hold the space until they did, caring about me, she said, and it came out quieter than she had intended, with less armor than she had planned. His jaw moved. He said, low and without decoration, I love you. Sienna. 3 words, not a speech, not a declaration engineered to produce a response, just a fact, stated in the same register he used for everything that mattered to him, which was to say plainly, without theater, with the weight of someone who had been carrying the thing for long enough that setting it down was almost physical. She felt it move through her like the pressure change she had felt in the kitchen. That same sudden reorientation of something she had not known was pointing the wrong direction. She did not say it back immediately. She looked at him, at his face in the winter lamplight, at the man who had walked across a cafe floor and said 2 sentences and made a dangerous person leave, who had stood in a doorway and heard her say she didn't know if she was staying and had nodded and walked away and let her have the space even when it was costing him something, who had called her sister and learned her name, who had set a cup of coffee on the counter and never mentioned it. And she thought, I have been so afraid of being held that I almost missed someone trying to hold me in the only way he knew how. She reached across the distance between them on the couch. The distance that had been 4 feet in the kitchen and was smaller now, and she put her hand over his where it rested on the cushion between them. He looked down at her hand and then back up at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen before, or had seen and not allowed herself to name, which was that he was not certain, which was that he was sitting here with everything he controlled stripped away and was just a person waiting to find out if the thing he wanted most was going to be available to him. "I'm not there yet," she said, and felt him absorb it, and kept her hand where it was. "But I'm not looking for the door anymore." His hand turned under hers and held it, not tight, just present, the way he did everything, with a certainty that was not about force, but about intention. "That's enough," he said. "That is genuinely enough." She looked at him for a long moment, at the apartment around them, at the blanket on the chair and the photograph on the dresser and the window with the city behind it. 14 weeks of a heartbeat she had spent 3 weeks being afraid to tell him about. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something starts without a ceremony, without a contract, without anyone's family in a room deciding the terms. It looked like a couch in December and a hand held and 2 people who had been very bad at being known by each other deciding, without paperwork and without spectacle. To try. She leaned back against the cushions and did not let go of his hand and looked at the ceiling and exhaled. Slowly. The way you exhaled when you had been holding something for a long time and had finally found somewhere to set it down. He stayed where he was, outside the windows. The city moved through its Tuesday evening. Cabs and corners and 10,000 lit rectangles of other people's lives, indifferent as ever. And inside the apartment, 43 floors above all of it, the silence was different now. Not the silence of 2 people avoiding something, the other kind, the kind that had room in it